welcome my dear friend, Bethany Bradsher.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking when Joe was talking about our time in Monroe that the first weekend I was ever the weekend reporter, and in Monroe there was one weekend reporter who covered everything. So whatever happened that weekend in Union County, you were writing about it. And I had grown up in Houston, Texas, like she mentioned, so I was kind of a big city girl. And I'm sitting there and I get a phone call at the desk, and I pick it up and I hear a voice say, "You want to see a car that's been really messed up by a deer?" And I really didn't know if that was news or not. And so that was kind of the way I got my start there. It was very interesting. So I have traveled a long way since those days. We also used to write stories about giant vegetables that people grew, and they would bring them into us, which was great. And so I've had a privilege in the last few years of getting to write about some of the best and most historic, most legendary coaches in the history of ACC basketball. And this is something I've always had a passion for history and for ACC hoops. And through these last two books that I've written, I've really been able to tell some great stories. And this is a good time to be talking about this right in the middle of ACC season. It's about as good of an ACC season as I've seen in a while. So I feel like this is very appropriate. And the two coaches I'm talking about are Everett Case and Bones McKinney. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of them. Everett Case kind of through the vehicle of a tournament that he loved and founded called the Dixie Classic. Just by way of introduction to these two, I have a friend named Jack Murdoch, who is a legendary player for Wake Forest back in the 50s. And many of you remember Jack, the scrappiest individual on the basketball court that has ever lived. And he's been so helpful to me through both of these projects. And the way Jack Murdoch puts it, he says, Everett Case brought big-time basketball to the South, but Bones McKinney brought big-time coaching. And he was very close to both. And so he understands the really singular place that these two men hold in the history of the sport, and that really North Carolina hasn't always been a basketball state. It's hard for many of us, my generation and younger, to realize or to even appreciate that, but in the mid-1940s, when Everett Case came to Raleigh to become the head coach at NC State, this was a football state. Basketball didn't have the attention that it has now. The rivalries had not yet formed. And Everett came to town, and his goal was to see a basketball goal in every driveway in North Carolina. He was the ultimate salesman. He was once voted Salesman of the Year by the Raleigh Chamber of Commerce. And one of his showpieces of his campaign to kind of bring, elevate basketball in this state, he was from Indiana, so he understood what that looked like. And one of his showpieces was a tournament called the Dixie Classic. Before I go any further, how many people in this room got to attend a Dixie Classic tournament? That's a good number. That's exciting. So this has been such a treat for me. And when I had the idea raised to me, why don't you write a book about the Dixie Classic, I didn't know a whole lot about it. And so I started to ask some friends of mine who were basketball fans who were in their 70s, and the tournament ended in 1961, so it's been a long time since it was played. But as soon as I would say, I'm thinking about writing a book about the Dixie Classic, their eyes would light up. And they were like that little boy again, running down the stairs on Christmas morning to see if the Dixie Classic tickets were in the stocking. For those of you that are uninitiated, as I was, the Dixie Classic was a holiday collegiate tournament played between Christmas and New Year's every year from 1949 to 1960. There were 12 of them. Always the Big Four, North Carolina, NC State, Wake Forest, and Duke, against 4 outside teams. And it was a great event. It was pre-TV coverage. You had to be in the building to appreciate it and to get to experience it. And it was some of the best basketball that was ever played in the South, I believe. Everett Case didn't bring in patsy teams. He brought in some of the top teams from throughout the country. And in some cases, it was tremendous competition, and all this very early in the season. So I'm going to spend also time on Bones McKinney, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of the Dixie Classic as I got to experience it through the people that attended and the players and so many to whom it meant so much. So a few of the highlights, and if you look, I have a few slides. The first thing I want to mention is NC State had a stranglehold on this thing early on. They dominated in the early days. They won 6 out of the first 7 Dixie Classics. And it really speaks to Everett Case and his coaching ability and his recruiting prowess. He was from Indiana. His early teams were almost exclusively from Indiana. So he brought in these really amazing players, and they dominated. He kind of dominated his own playground, so to speak, but then he became a victim of his own success, because the other programs in the state, and at that point, of course, Wake Forest was in Old Wake Forest, so everyone was in 20 minutes of one another. And they started to bring in coaches like Frank McGuire at North Carolina, and Bones McKinney at Wake, and really who started to catch on to the recruiting and the style of play, a much faster style than had been played previously. And so before long, other schools were starting to knock off NC State on a regular basis. One of the things I love to tell as we talk about kind of the ascendancy of basketball in this state is that the first 6 Dixie Classics were all contested between a Big Four team and an outside team. So the final of the tournament was always played between an outside team and one of our North Carolina schools. The second 6, 5 out of those 6 were played between 2 Big Four schools. So that in itself kind of shows you that that rising tide did lift all boats, and you saw the seeds of the rivalries that were now enjoyed. Carolina Duke kind of started during this time. NC State Wake Forest was pretty heated. North Carolina Wake Forest, there were some brawls between those 2 schools that if they were to happen today, they would dominate ESPN for a week. So it was quite an interesting time. Of all of this, well, I need to mention this. Of 12 Dixie Classics, no school from outside North Carolina ever won the tournament. And that is something that obviously those of us that love North Carolina basketball are very proud of. And there were some very close calls, but it never happened. And the closest call was in 1958. And this is a highlight. There we go. We'll let Jessica do it. Thank you. If you look up there on the slide, that's Oscar Robertson, and he was the top player in the country in 1958. He brought his Cincinnati team down here, and they were the #1 team, #1 player, and another of the guests was Michigan State, featuring Jumpin' Johnny Green. And so these were not only 2 of the top players in the country, they were the first 2 African-American players to come down and play in the tournament. So there were so many different milestones, so much happening kind of in the social landscape in Raleigh at the time. On the basketball side, it was a tremendous tournament. There were 4 teams in the top 6 in the nation when the tournament started. The 2 I mentioned, North Carolina and NC State. And Cincinnati came and they beat Wake Forest in the first round and then lost their subsequent 2 games. And NC State ended up winning that tournament. They won 9 out of the 12 Dixie Classics that were ever played, but that was the most precious win to Everett Case, the coach, because it was the hardest fought. Also, as I explored just the kind of social landscape, it was so interesting to understand what happened because the hotels in Raleigh were still segregated at that time. And so there was a fraternity house in Raleigh that was kind of renovated into a de facto hotel for these 2 teams when they came down. So it was definitely a different time. But that tournament was one that stands out. If you ask anyone about the Dixie Classic, the first one they want to tell you about was 1958. Another one was the Wake Forest victory in 1959. That's Everett Case. Sorry, I'll go to that, so let's leave it up there. But I do want to mention that in 1959, Wake Forest won its only Dixie Classic, and the MVP of that tournament was a brash sophomore guard from Pennsylvania named Billy Packer, who I understand has spoken to this club before. And I've been able to go to Billy's house 2 times for the 2 books and hear his stories and his memories. Nobody knew who he was in 1959 when Wake Forest won this tournament, but that didn't matter to Billy. He scored 61 points over the course of 3 games, shot 57% from the floor, and they knew who he was after that. So that was a great moment for Wake Forest. And finally, in the history of this tournament, you have to mention its ending. The Dixie Classic was ended because of a point shaving scandal, and it was such a fascinating thing and a really dark time in college basketball history, but there was a web of gamblers that were paying players to fix games, and it extended all the way up the eastern seaboard. Well, they played the Dixie Classic in 1960. Everett Case, who's in this picture, had already invited teams for the next year, so it was all set. And early in 1961, one school after another started to fall in this domino effect of this point shaving scandal, as different gamblers and players who were involved kind of told on each other. You know, they would give witness. And so in March of 1961, the News and Observer had a headline that looked like a war type headline, that some of their players had been implicated in the point shaving scandal, and later also some from North Carolina. And a long story that I don't have time for, but as a result of that, Bill Friday, the president of the UNC Systems at the time, made the decision to cancel the Dixie Classic. To him, it represented the excess of college athletics overshadowing the academic mission of the university. That sound familiar today? We figured that out, right? We don't have that problem anymore. In fact, I had the privilege of sitting in Bill Friday's office on the Carolina campus late in 2010 or early in 2011 and talked to him and got his side of the story. And at that time, you know, North Carolina was embroiled in the whole football scandal. I guess that hasn't quite died down yet. So it was a real reminder, but that's something he has fought for throughout his career. So the NC State, that's the Wake Forest team. Sorry, I got this mixed up. And there's one more Dixie Classic slide in there. And that's that last tournament final that was played between North Carolina and Duke. And I do believe that was kind of the early seedlings of this rivalry that we enjoy today. That was the only time those two teams met in the Dixie Classic final, and North Carolina did win that final one. So through my research of the Dixie Classic, I encountered so many fascinating people. And I was so struck by the coaches and how colorful the coaches were back in that time and how interesting they were. And I learned so much and have had such a great time learning about these individuals. But there was one who stood out to me. So when I finished the book about the Dixie Classic, people would say, what are you going to work on next? And I didn't really know. I kept saying, I really want to write about Bones McKinney, because Bones McKinney was one of a kind. And I didn't know a whole lot about him, but I knew enough to know I wanted to know more. And so I set about getting in touch with his kids, and they gave me their permission to be part of this. And I decided to really do a comprehensive look at his life. And I learned so much more about him than what I kind of knew, which was that he was a crazy man on the sideline and a coach who, put on a show. But there was so much more beneath the surface. Bones McKinney once wrote this about himself. I plead guilty to driving through life at about 80 miles an hour, drinking 60,000 Pepsi Colas, smoking some 2 million cigarettes, and threatening the lives of several hundred referees. I was so intrigued by that description that I included it in the Dixie Classic book, but I knew that we could dig a little deeper in the surface. There we go. And there's a great Bones picture there. And so I started to try to figure out a little bit more about who he was. And these are a few things I learned. Bones was a high school dropout, a basketball player for both NC State and North Carolina, a Baptist preacher, a soldier during World War II, a coach who brought his team to its only Final Four, a loyal friend, a father of 6, a devoted husband, a businessman, a comedian, and the most coveted public speaker in the state for decades. And even that list doesn't do him justice. As one of the most unique figures to live in the past century of North Carolina sports history, Bones McKinney had a significant impact on the communities around him, on the sport he loved, and I believe that basketball had a huge impact on his life as well. So in the time I have left, I want to talk a little bit about really his legacies. And there are a couple different areas where his impact was so big that I believe we still feel it today. The first way that Bones McKinney had an impact was by making the game fun. And that's the one we all know the best. I try to look at our game today, and I think we've corporatized and buttoned up college basketball to the point where we don't have any Bones McKinneys anymore. You can kind of look back to Jerry Tarkanian, Lefty Drizel, and, maybe Bobby Knight, but that wasn't all that much fun. But he had a good personality. And there just isn't anybody like Bones. They didn't call technicals all that much back then, and many of you who knew about Bones or knew him will remember that he had a seatbelt installed on his chair on the bench in the mid-1960s in an effort to rein him in because they were starting to call more technicals. But nobody worked the sideline the way Bones did. And this goes back to his legendary high school team, the Durham High Bulldogs. And there's someone here that went to Durham High that knew Bones when he was young, Tom, who talked to me about that. This team, the Durham High Bulldogs, won 69 straight games when Bones was part of the team from 1938 to 1940. And they were so good that the teams around North Carolina wouldn't play them anymore. And so they had to play the state championship teams from up and down the eastern seaboard. They literally traveled from New York to Florida to play state championship teams. The coach of that team, Paul Sykes, who's in the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame, told Bones at one point, Bones, I want you to get out there and get something started. He figured out that he didn't have just a good basketball player. He had somebody who could maybe get the crowd on their side, or maybe antagonize an official or an opponent. Because Bones was a born comedian. He always had a one-liner, and he was constant, perpetual motion. And so his coach kind of gave him permission. And Bones said, that's all I needed to hear. The next thing you know, I might have been playing trombone in the band. And from those early days, as a player, he first at NC State, then at Fort Bragg for 4 years during the war, then at North Carolina, where he played for a national championship in 1946. I like to say Bones is the Forrest Gump of basketball, because he was kind of everywhere where things were happening. And then in an early NBA career, that was the very earliest years of the NBA. The NBA had just formed when Bones came out of North Carolina in 1946, and an unknown coach named Red Auerbach, who was trying to start a team in Washington called the Capitals, invited Bones to come up and be part of his team. So instead of taking a desk job at Haynes Hosiery, which is where he was headed, he went up to Washington and became a professional basketball player for 6 years. And some of the best stories about Bones' courtside behavior are from those NBA years. Because nobody really thought that professional basketball was going to make it anyway. So people weren't paying much attention to it, so he could kind of do what he wanted. And I do believe that people started to show up at the games just to see what Bones McKinney would do next. He was definitely a crowd favorite. One night in St. Louis, Bones became very irritable with the organist in the arena because every time one of the Capitals players approached the foul line, the organist would play a funeral dirge. And every time they missed a shot, he would play this kind of bazoo sound. So this is what Bones said. I walked to the foul line and signaled for a timeout. I ran up into the stands, went to the organist, picked him up, and deposited him about 20 feet up in the stands. Then I admonished him with my finger, walked back to the foul line, and made my shot. So of course, this behavior just continued when he became a coach. And after his professional career was over, Bones felt called into the Baptist ministry, so he enrolled in seminary at Southeastern. And there's a few pictures here of him. Sorry, I get caught up in where I'm doing. Let's look at a couple of those, and I'll tell you about that. That's the Army. And there's the Washington Capitals Bones. That's a nice shot. And a few of these, we can leave that up, are from his coaching days. So he enrolled in seminary and pretty soon found himself the assistant coach at Wake Forest. Murray Greason, the head coach, found out that Bones McKinney was there on his campus and he needed an assistant and hired him. And so that was one of many ways that basketball intervened in his life to change his path. And so as a coach, even as an assistant coach, back then assistants didn't just have to sit next to the head coach, and Murray was kind of this cool, unflappable guy, and Bones was going crazy. But he made constant round trips to the water bucket all the time, or later was drinking Pepsis one after another, patting officials on the head when they got a call right, falling on his knees behind the official when they got it wrong. One of Bones' things that he liked to say about officials is the only thing wrong with referees is they don't care who wins. And he loved to antagonize. Many of you remember Lou Bello, and Lou Bello was his favorite foil. I believe they really were very good friends, and they went way back. But the two of them were such big names that in the 1960s, when Wake Forest went down to play at Georgia Tech one night, the headline in the Atlanta paper said, "Bones Bello here tonight." And I want you to think of another time when the coach and the official would get top billing in a game. So it was very unique. One night against St. Bonaventure, it was here in Charlotte, and it was in the NCAA tournament, so this stuff didn't just happen in games that didn't matter. They're playing St. Bonaventure in the NCAA tournament, and Bones had these endlessly long legs. He was 6'6", he had a lot of comparisons to Ichabod Crane, and when he could manage to stay seated, his legs never stopped. So he was kicking his legs around, and he wore these cheap loafers, and one of his shoes flew off into the middle of the court. And so the teams were down here, so Bones went out, to try, very subtly, to try to retrieve his shoe, and in so doing, he bent down and all the pens fell out of his pocket. So he got the pens, but at that time, the ball had changed hands, teams were coming back, so he started to play defense on St. Bonaventure. He didn't get a technical because it told the official he was just cleaning debris off the court. So definitely, there are so many stories. No one ever worked the sideline the way Bones did. And what does this mean? It means it was a blast to watch him and to be part of his teams, but I believe it also helped put people in the seats. It helped elevate the game of basketball. In 1960, Life magazine came to Wake Forest to do a 4-page photo editorial of Bones. It was called The Erupting Antics of Mr. Bones, and we'll get to that one. There's a couple other shots, but there's one of, you can see the constant activity. There it is. And so probably the pinnacle of media attention in 1960 was Life magazine. And Wake Forest wasn't really on the map, but suddenly Bones was. And I think that we can't even measure the impact of what that meant, just by being himself and the way that he helped put people in the seats and bring this sport that really wasn't that highly regarded when he started playing it in the late 1930s, early 40s. Basketball took a back seat to just about everything else that America paid attention to, and helped really change that. Bones was also an amazing coach, and I have to mention this because his former players would want me to. That he wasn't just a clown. He wasn't just a crazy man on the sideline, but those who played for him said that they've never seen anybody who could hold so much in their brain for that 2 hours, make the adjustments he could make, use timeouts to his advantage. He would see something 20 seconds in from an opposing defense he didn't expect, call a timeout and change everything, and the players couldn't keep up. He had a very high basketball IQ. He had learned from some of the best, Red Auerbach, I mentioned, and a number of other coaches through his circuitous path. And so he really brought that to bear at Wake Forest, and he was obviously very successful, bringing them to the Final Four and just having so much success. His first big project as a coach was a big country boy, 6'6", from Jonesville, North Carolina, named Dickie Hemrick. When Bones got to campus as an assistant coach, he took one look at that kid and he asked Murray Greason, "Can I have 30 minutes with him every day after practice?" And from that project grew an All-American who is still in the top 5 of many categories in the ACC. He was an amazing player. And that just was a credit to Bones and the way he had learned to be a big man himself. They were the same size, and he passed that on to Dickie Hemrick. And it was a privilege to get to interview Dickie about his experience learning from Bones McKinney. Another of his legacies that I have to mention because it was news to me is that Bones McKinney helped integrate the game of basketball. This was in 1950 when he was still with the Washington Capitals. Red Auerbach had moved on, and at that time, to save money, they would have a player coach. So he was still playing a little, he was getting older, but he was also the coach. And at that time, there had not been a black player in the NBA, but there were several. He had seen this kid named Earl Lloyd play up in a tournament in D.C. He was from West Virginia, and he was the kind of talent he really needed on his roster. And so we went to the president of the team and got permission to draft Earl Lloyd. It's worth mentioning that it was different from Jackie Robinson in Major League Baseball because 4 African-American players came in at the same time. Earl Lloyd was the first one on the calendar to play in a game, so he gets credit with breaking the color barrier in the NBA, and that happened because of Bones. I got to interview Earl Lloyd. He's living in rural Tennessee, and he loved to share his memories. Unfortunately, he only got to play 7 games under Bones because the Capitals folded. They were having financial trouble. And Earl Lloyd was drafted into the Korean War. After his service, he had a really nice NBA career, but he told me his one regret is he didn't get to play more for Bones McKinney. And so that was just something that's really important about his legacy. And there's so many more areas, and I've mentioned some of them. Bones was a high school dropout, and he was convinced to come back to high school by that high school coach, Paul Sykes. And through his path, so many places and times that basketball, like I said, intervened and changed his course. And his life is just fascinating, and it's like a history of the sport in our state and of really the elevation of basketball, since he started playing in the 1930s. Bones was certainly one of a kind. There was nobody like him. That's the phrase you hear about him more than anything else. And through researching and writing this book, I've learned he was so much more than that clown on the sidelines. He was a scholar of the game, an exceptional motivator, a dedicated family man, and truly an ambassador for the state of North Carolina. He retired from coaching for good in 1971 after a very brief stint with the Carolina Cougars, many of you remember. He was the first head coach for that short-lived team. And for the next 26 years, until his death from the effects of a stroke at the age of 78, he traveled all over the state, and sometimes beyond the state, but he hated to fly, speaking in front of every kind of group imaginable. How many people ever heard him speak in person? Often I speak at Rotaries where he also spoke, so that's really fun. And everybody who ever heard him said that they have never heard a public speaker like Bones, that he had an uncanny ability to entertain and inspire, to tell all these different stories, and you didn't know where the threads of them were going, and to tie them together at the end without a single note in a way that was so memorable that he would leave people wanting more. And so in the spirit of a Bones speech, and we can go, I'll show you, there's a picture of him speaking at the end. We can flip through. There's the last one, next one. There it is. Those fingers, you can kind of see. In the spirit of a Bones speech, I want to leave you with one of his favorite stories, and it was inspired by his childhood spent in his tiny hometown of Lowland, North Carolina. Now, I'm from the East, and I have visited Lowland. I made my husband take me there in interest of research. It's in Greater Hoboken. Anyone? All right, New Bern? We're getting closer? Okay. So it is a spot in the road, and Bones lived there until he was 5, but he would go back in the summers to work on his Uncle Fred's tobacco farm. And some of his favorite stories were inspired by those times, some of them even true. So on this particular day, Bones and his Uncle Fred were napping on the screen porch when there was a knock on the door. His Aunt Pearl answered the door and was greeted by a salesman carrying a brand new vacuum cleaner. When Aunt Pearl opened the door, the salesman threw a handful of manure on the only rug she had. "Lady," the salesman said, "if my vacuum cleaner won't clean that up, I'll eat it." "Come on in," Aunt Pearl said. "We ain't got electricity." So you can see how writing a book about Bones was entertaining. It's fun to get to share it with the world. I think I have a few minutes for questions. Do I? Okay, a few minutes for questions right here.